I'll start. And you're live now, Helen.
Hi everybody, good afternoon, and thank you for coming to a briefing about the Charter for Social Housing Residents, which is a core part of the Social Housing White Paper, which was published about 2 weeks ago today. I'm just going to introduce the session, and then Jamie's going to go through a little bit of the content of the White Paper. But I just wanted to start by saying that this is a mandatory session for all network home staff, and there is a reason for that. I genuinely believe that social housing is at a turning point, that the press that we're receiving at the moment, that the general reputational issues that the fire safety problems have caused to us, that the general impact of the Grenfell tragedy has resulted in this white paper, and it has resulted in the need for everybody to recognise that we have to make a change. There are perceptual problems for housing associations, which we've had, you know, for a long time, and which we deal with on a day-to-day basis, but which we've absolutely got to redouble and renew our efforts to address. And they relate to responsiveness, and they relate to listening to residents and accepting that sometimes our communications could be better and that our performance could be better, but also, you know, balancing that against the things that we do well and the things that we're strong at. Making this sort of change in our reputation is a job for everybody who works for network homes. It's not just a job for the front line, and that's why these sessions are mandatory. We are all in frontline services. And quite often the people who work in our neighbourhood teams and, you know, at the most sort of sharp end of our functions are the people who get all the criticism. But actually, we are all here to support those frontline workers, and we're all here to help make the change to our public reputation that this Charter for Social Housing Residents absolutely demands. And I want everybody in network to be really aware of that. We're starting obviously with networks directly employed people, but the content of this white paper has lots of relevance to contractors and others who work for us. And we need all of them to be aware of it as well, because obviously their performance reflects pretty much entirely back on network homes. So this is not the last time we're going to be talking about this. This is an introduction, and Jamie will tell you about the content now, and then as we close, we'll perhaps talk about what next. Okay, I'll hand over to Jamie.
Thanks, Helen. Am I unmuted now? Oh, it's gone. Yeah, hello everyone. So I'm going to run through a presentation setting out a bit of the history and the key points that are in the social housing white paper. As we go through, feel free to ask questions. The way this is set up, all I can see is my slides at the moment, but if there's any question that could be answered immediately, Diddy will flag that to me, otherwise we'll pick them up at the end. And so the first thing worth saying is this has been some time in the making, and the social housing green paper was first mentioned a long time before August 2018, and there was quite a lot of pre-consultation that government did talking to social tenants, and then a really large amount of consultation after it was published. And so you can see there over 1,000 responses came back to the green paper, and there were also a large number of direct engagements from ministers. I think 3 different housing ministers were involved in it due to changes in tenure over time, of directly speaking to social housing residents and understanding their key concerns and how they wanted things to go better. There's obviously quite a lot of things have happened since August 2018, and I think probably the white paper would have come out before now if some of them hadn't happened. It was a commitment made in the Conservative Party manifesto just about a year ago, and it's now been published a couple of weeks ago. As Helen said, it sets out a range of confirmed proposals, and for that reason there's no consultation on the white paper itself. And we've been told by officials at the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government that there's a very clear reason for that. They don't want to give people the impression that some elements of it aren't happening. There is a couple of consultations that are ongoing at the moment in relation to fire alarms and carbon monoxide alarms, and one coming on electrical safety. and a number of different elements of it are going to be subject to consultation, but the overall framework isn't. I think it's really important to see the white paper itself as a government does, which is very much a response to the tragic fire at Grenfell Tower, and they're very strongly reacting to the fact that residents were didn't feel that they were listened to, didn't feel they were treated with dignity and respect as part of that, and feeling that it could have been an avoidable tragedy. And that then led into the exercise and all the things that ministers and officials were told throughout that exercise. And so I think, as Helen said, it can be seen as a fundamental change to the way that we interact with residents, how we're expected to interact with residents, and the external forces that make us do some of that. There are a number of key messages which flow through it overall in terms of stronger consumer regulation for residents, empowering residents to influence what their landlord is doing, safety and quality, improvements to the complaints process, and I think fundamentally transparency and trust. And so in relation to that, I think we're starting from quite a good place in Network, of that we adopted the 5th strategic objective in terms of strengthening residents' trust in us. And alongside that, an aim for radical transparency, and all the work that has gone into changing the way that we engage with our residents, bringing the chairs of our residents panels into our governance structure. But there is still a lot for us to do. We're at the start of that journey in terms of strengthening trust, and we've set up some quite challenging aspirations in terms of how we're going to improve that over time. So, like, whilst I think we're in a good place and we've been predicting some of that because it's been a long time coming, there's still a lot for us to do, and there will be significant changes. So the white paper, as Helen said, is set out as a charter, and there are 7 elements to that charter, which form the different chapters of the white paper, and I'll just briefly pull out the key things which come out in each of those. To be safe in your home, obviously a fundamental expectation of residents, and in there is where there are the setting up of the consultations around the fire and carbon monoxide alarms, making those mandatory for social housing in the same way they are for the private rented sector, and increased tests on electrical safety. It also touches on building safety, which is clearly one of the biggest issues that are facing us at Network Homes. We have £100 million in our business plan in terms of costs that are going to be bought by us that we expect for remediation. And that's probably therefore one of the elements of the charter that is going to be more difficult. We can't instantly say that all our buildings are safe. We're going through a large programme with a lot of good work going on within the building safety team. But it's a complex solution which we haven't got a magic wand to improve. Knowing how your landlord is performing, and that kind of builds back into the transparency point, and I'm going to come to some performance indicators which are proposed in a minute, and also talk about an access to information scheme, which is also about transparency and openness. There's a section around having your complaints dealt with promptly and fairly, and that's largely about how the Housing Ombudsman, which is the escalated process once it's gone through our own complaints process, will operate. A 4th chapter around being treated with respect, and the second part of the chapter is with a stronger consumer regulator. So I'll explain shortly the changes which are being made to the Regulator of Social Housing so they can have an entirely new function focused on consumer regulation. And I think beyond those 4, the weight of the chapter starts to fall down slightly. And whilst there's a strong theme within the white paper of having your voice heard by your landlord and the importance of resident engagement, this chapter, which could have said quite a lot, doesn't say all that much, bar saying people should look for good practice, which I think should almost be a given, and then strays off into some diversions and kind of inconclusive diversions, including like the landlord's role in addressing loneliness. There's then some elements around a good quality home, and that does not a lot more than setting up a future piece of work on what the new decent home standard will look like. And it says that there'll be work that will conclude about this time next year, which will then set up some consultations. So that's some way off. And then some elements on antisocial behaviour that I'll come to in a minute. And then finally, a bit that's probably got most criticism from resident groups in the media around, within a social housing white paper, something focused on supporting people into home ownership. And that's partly because one of the big messages which was given to ministers and officials as part of the consultation was that stigma of social housing residents is a really significant issue and that needs to be addressed by politicians, the establishment, media, and presenting social housing as really second best to home ownership, as some people perceive this does, just adds to that stigma. And also some criticism that whilst it talks about what government is doing to expand social rented housing, doesn't propose any new actions and isn't really of the scale that the country needs, and particularly London needs, the part of the country with the greatest housing need, where we're mainly operating. So in terms of satisfaction measures, it sets out a number of different areas there with different measures or KPIs that each landlord would be required to collect and publish at least on an annual basis. But the white paper talks about ideally this information being available in almost real time digitally, so I guess on our websites. Some of these measures are things that we're actively monitoring ourselves based on fact. Some of them are based on surveys, some surveys that we don't currently do, like tenant satisfaction with the landlord contribution to the neighbourhood. And I think people would clearly answer that very differently depending on how active their landlord is in the area, how many homes it's got, what their area is like. And also probably worth noting that at the end, the overall satisfaction, we think that relates back to the STAR survey, which is the survey of tenants and residents. Philippa got that acronym right for me before, and which asks everybody, how satisfied are you? We currently just ask people that have experienced a transaction with us, so whether that's contacting the contact centre or having a repair done or signed up to a tenancy, those are the people that we survey to get our satisfaction measure. Asking everybody, regardless of whether they've had something to do with you, will give different answers, and I think there's a debate of how useful it is and what people will be basing that on if they haven't interacted with you. It's also worth noting that general surveys like that are typically a fair bit lower than the transactional surveys, and I think I've seen quoted 20% lower. Housemark sent me something the other day that suggested it was more like 12% lower, but I think everyone agrees an overall measure like that would give you a lower number. And it also then proposes some financial measures for transparency, where and relating those back to the size of the landlord, which I assume means number of homes. This information is available within our accounts, and for the last one there on cost per unit is one of the key measures that every housing association publishes, but I guess this will make it more readily available and accessible without you having to do different calculations. There was a suggestion in the green paper that the measures would somehow be put into league tables. League tables aren't mentioned within the white paper, but presuming that this information is made available on websites, I'm sure some people will scrape it together and produce it into league tables. We saw Inside Housing do something on that recently with the number of determinations made by the Housing Ombudsman that are negative against the landlord relative by stock size, and that was quite an interesting insight. And on that, actually, Network were the best within the G15 overall of having the lowest number of negative decisions by the Ombudsman per home. Continuing with that theme of transparency, there's also a proposal for an access to information scheme, which is around giving the right to tenants and their representatives. And that's one element that I'm sure will need some clarification. It lists potentially political representatives and also journalists to ask information of the landlord, and the landlord then being required to follow a process which is similar to the Freedom of Information Act. This would be imposed by regulation by the Regulator of Social Housing, which means it would only apply to social housing residents, which is tenants and shared owners who haven't yet fully staircased. And there would be a process to go through. There's a number of exemptions in the Freedom of Information Act, and the white paper implies that those would continue. But the Housing Ombudsman would have the power to, if we refuse something or if something isn't treated in a way to the resident or their representative's satisfaction, to appeal to the Housing Ombudsman through that. I think this goes very much with the aim that Network's adopted of radical transparency as part of the 5th strategic objective on trust, and the fact that we've sort of stated a presumption in favour of publishing. So if we're doing anything, our assumption would be that we'd make things available publicly. There are obviously some things that we can't, of personal information or things that are commercially sensitive, but they should be covered by the freedom of information exemptions. There's also an exemption under the freedom of information of cost of not going over, I think it's £500 per request. There's normally at this point in the previous two a question of like, how would this be paid for overall? And we don't know at the moment. If you look at a public sector body similar size to Network, they might have one person who's doing freedom of information full time. I hope there's a way that we would be able to implement that in a more streamlined way, because obviously that would come with some cost, and there's other costs within this as well. Probably the most significant part of the white paper is in relation to the regulator and the consumer regulation, and this was something that was kind of very clearly signalled within the green paper, and a number of people, including Grenfell United and Shelter, called for there to be a separate regulator of consumer standards in social housing, and that hasn't happened, and I think that's a good thing for clarity of roles, that we've already got the regulator of social housing and the housing ombudsman, and the who goes where for what is already not entirely clear all the time to residents. And we're having a new building safety regulator coming in for high risk residential buildings with the draft building safety bill. Having a fourth organisation in there, I think, would have made it more complicated. So I think this is to be welcomed. The current regulator does do a good job, but it's very clear from the white paper that this is an entirely new function which will be established within the regulator of social housing. Indeed, they've already advertised for a new director of consumer regulation. It went up on Wednesday. I think the deadline's the 17th of December. A 3-year role to establish that, and they're clearly wanting to move on at pace with as much as they can, as quickly as they can, to design and set this function up. The way in which this is being enabled is by removing what's called the serious detriment test, which is the way that the regulator currently enforces its consumer standards, and it does have standards around the home and the tenancy and rent standards. That it will only intervene if there is a risk of serious detriment, and serious detriment is the risk of serious injury or death to one or more people. And that means for lots of the engagement that the regulator currently has, it will be on things related to health and safety. So the most common intervention are people whose records on gas servicing aren't up to date, and that's obviously got a clear potential health and safety impact. Going forward, it's clear that that bar will be removed, so there'll be proactive regulation of everything that relates to residents and the expectations. There isn't clarity on exactly how that works or exactly what the standards are going to be, and that will develop over time. As it says there, that the principle of co-regulation is retained, and that's the expectation that the regulator doesn't tell us exactly how to do everything. Indeed, there's a statutory duty on the regulator of social housing to minimise their interference in the sector and only do what's absolutely necessary. And that's because boards and our residents should be shaping the direction of how we work as independent organisations, and that principle is reaffirmed within the white paper. So there's not going to be a precise way of doing everything that is set out. The regulator gets some increased powers, including removing the cap on the fines that it can pass through, and also an ability to arrange repairs and go in and inspect or survey individual properties more rapidly. I think that's probably very much a backstop power if something's gone very much wrong, for them to be able to carry out a repair. I can't imagine the regulator's going to be wanting to take that on any significant level. In order to police this, there will be routine inspections. So at the moment we have in-depth assessments which are looking at our governance and financial viability, and will be generally a series of interviews with some board members and some executives. By having some inspections for the consumer regulation, that will involve talking to a wider range of people, I'm sure, and going in and seeing different things, but exactly how that works, how often they'll happen, and to what timetable, I don't think we're clear. But I think because of that point on co-regulation, we can be quite clear that they won't be following the same process that the Audit Commission used to follow in and its key lines of inquiry. The other thing, which isn't directly relevant to network, but I think is quite important for how the regulator is going to work overall, and therefore has some knock-on impact on us, is the fact that the regulator will be doing this also for councils who own housing and their arm's length management organisations and any tenant management organisations that they have.
Jamie, sorry to interrupt. There's a question from Elizabeth Lill, so I'll read it out. It's, do we know what the routine inspections might look like? Will it be like the old Audit Commission style?
So we really don't know, but I think we can be pretty clear that they won't be the same as the Audit Commission. There won't be very prescriptive things that you're required to do, which are what was set out in the key lines of inquiry, the Chloes that the Audit Commission used to follow. But they must be coming in to look at some things, otherwise how do they come with a view? We also don't really know what the outcome of the inspections will be, and there must be some signals to the market, but there's been some discussion of, at the moment, the regulator gives people a governance and a viability rating, so you could also give people a consumer rating, but a feeling that might confuse banks and funders. And the white paper also is very clear that the regulator's role in providing assurance to funders that the sector is well managed and viable is really important, because that's how we are able to borrow at a lower rate and able to invest in our homes and build new affordable homes going forward. But there must be something coming out of him, whether it's a pass or a fail. I think it's more likely to be something like that, along with a narrative judgment, than stars. But there's really a lot of detail to emerge there. So I was just talking about the role in relation to councils. So at the moment, the regulator's governance and viability function only looks at housing associations and for-profit providers of affordable housing. But this will be sort of a significant different step for stock owning councils and for the regulator having a different relationship with them. The newest rent regulation meant the regulator is now regulating councils' rent setting. So that's kind of the start of it. But I think there's going to be quite a journey to go on, and it will undoubtedly take some time and resources from the regulator to establish those relationships and in councils to understand it. So I think just one for us to watch and be aware of. The Housing Ombudsman, I think, has been becoming increasingly active in the last year and a bit, and recently consulted on and implemented a new complaints handling code, which all housing associations are required to produce a self-assessment on by the end of this year, and then implement an improvement programme, and that sets out some more onerous expectations from landlords in terms of how they handle complaints. The white paper announces some things which continue to take that further forward. The Housing Ombudsman has been moving towards greater transparency and published a report recently on leasehold insights and issues that are arising in terms of complaints in relation to leasehold. The white paper now sets out that from the end of March, every single case will be, the details of it will be published by the Ombudsman. What the details are, I don't know, probably not individual personal information, but some narrative of what happened and of the judgment of whether it was a decision of maladministration or not. And so that changes things in terms of transparency. The Housing Ombudsman, at the moment, people can only refer complaints to it once they've exhausted a landlord's complaints process, and either if a democratic representative has forwarded it on, or the end of an 8-week waiting period. It was already proposed in the draft building safety bill that what's called the democratic filter be removed. So once you've exhausted the complaints process, you can go straight to the Housing Ombudsman. And I think pretty much everyone agrees with that. I don't think many representatives were having the time or resources to look into a complaint and forward it on. So most people just ended up waiting 8 weeks, and that isn't a very satisfactory period of time or barrier. I think partly the point I referenced before of there being 3 different regulators or quasi-regulators working together means it is really important that the lines and the roles and responsibility between the Ombudsman and the regulator are laid out, and the white paper does set out quite a lot in relation to that, of making sure that each organisation is a statutory consultee of each other and of the new building safety regulator, and that they're required to have memorandums of understanding and work together. And so I think there's positive things there on being greater clarity for us as a landlord, but also for our residents to know whose role it is to do what. So I mentioned there's some points in relation to antisocial behaviour, and this has clearly been another issue which has been pretty significant to Network over the last few months. I think through lockdown we've seen antisocial behaviour, I think treble, it's come down a little bit, but it's still at a much higher level than it was before the lockdown. We've recently published a antisocial behaviour toolkit which sets out very clearly to residents what is antisocial behaviour, what we can do, what they need to do, what the police can do and intervene on. But we had a resident meeting earlier this week, and there were a number of cases of people who are unhappy with where they've got to in relation to antisocial behaviour. So it's something where there is clearly more work to do. I think a commitment in the white paper to clarify the responsibilities of who does what in relation to antisocial behaviour could be really important, and we've done that in our toolkit. But I think quite often for things that are crime, people will phone the police and they'll say they haven't got the resources to do it, or they're not going to investigate. I think if the government clearly says this is a police responsibility, this is a crime, that will hopefully have greater effect. As well as some work on looking at what are the causes of antisocial behaviour and therefore what could be done to address it going forward. And then also a proposal that the representatives of housing associations, so that's the National Housing Federation, and the representatives of councils, so that's the Local Government Association, work together on a community trigger on how that's used. And Jackie Trundle explained to me what it was in the first one, and Debbie Blythe explained to me on the second one. I've still got Debbie's thing. So the community trigger is a process which allows members of the community to ask the Community Safety Partnership to review their responses to complaints of antisocial behaviour. And so that's if there's been 3 separate incidents within 6 months, and you have to use it within a month. So a clearer process there of basically giving a tool to residents who feel that their concerns of antisocial behaviour aren't being dealt with to be looked at in a different way. And then I think finally, before we come to further questions and answers, partly relating back to that stigma point I referenced, but there's a clear note in the white paper that some residents feel like they're not treated with respect or empathy. They're treated like second-class citizens, and as a result, government saying there needs to be greater professionalisation in the way that landlords work, the way that we manage our homes. I think that point on respect was something that also came through in the meeting earlier this week, where sadly a number of our residents were saying that they felt fobbed off in some things, or they felt like they weren't treated with respect. And they might be small numbers of people, but anyone feeling like that clearly is something that we want to do something to address. And this could be quite a significant change, I think, with a working group looking at what professional standards, expectations, qualifications need to be put in place to address how you treat people with respect and empathy. I think I'm sure that's welcome, but I would say you don't really need a professional qualification to treat somebody with respect. I'm sure there's more that everybody could do to improve their communication, and that's something that we have been putting some effort into, but it's probably something for people to reflect upon in all our dealings with residents, and how we can kind of address that feeling for some people. And I think that's the end of questions, and I'm going to take my slides off so I can actually see a few people and take a sip of some water. Yeah, have we got any questions in, Diddy?
No, only Elizabeth is sending in her questions. So yeah, guys, please send in your questions for Jamie and Helen to answer.
Whilst we're waiting for people to get their thoughts formulated, can I just say that the regulatory end of this is quite important. I mean, both in itself, because obviously, you know, poor regulatory outcomes have very significant implications for any organisation, but also for us to think about over the forthcoming months, because there is an opportunity to shape some aspects of how this works out through the consultative process. The content of the social housing white paper, as Jamie says, is not up for discussion, but some of the detail of how it's implemented definitely is. And I would like us to really think hard about how we can best respond to the general messages about transparency, empathy, respect, and service standards, but also attempt to shape the consumer regulation in a way that makes it fair and, you know, does what it's intended to do, which is to give residents some teeth if they've got problems that they can't get resolved by their housing providers. So as well as questions about the content of the white paper, I'd be very interested in suggestions as to what we could or should be doing to respond to its general themes. In relation to what Elizabeth has already asked, I think what we're being told is that somehow or other the inspection element of the regime will be added on to the in-depth assessment process. So, you know, if we're having an in-depth assessment of some kind, there will be some physical inspection element to it. Whether that results in a separate consumer standard, I think is doubtful. As Jamie said, the regulator is still very concerned to make sure that the principle of co-regulation is maintained, but also that we don't frighten off potential lenders to the sector or start putting up the price of money. But yeah, it's definitely intended that it involves some physical inspection around the IDA process.
Talking of money, Helen, there's a question in the last two sessions around there are lots of additional burdens here, and what does it mean for us in terms of the money that we spend and use of our resources?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and it relates to a lot of other things being discussed at the moment. And I think it will have the impact, and this is not necessarily a bad thing, but it will have the impact of pushing up investment in existing stock. Because, you know, first of all, there's a consultation on a revision to the Decent Homes Standard. Much of the dissatisfaction that does exist in social housing revolves around repair and stock condition. Now, clearly the government don't want the new supply of housing to dry up, because there are still large numbers of people who have no access to affordable housing, and it's only really social housing that's going to fill that need for many people. But nevertheless, I think there will be some readjustment of priorities towards investment in existing stock.
We've also had a question coming from Crystal, which I think is partly a nudge to me for something that I should have said and did say in the previous two sessions, but forgot this time. But Helen might want to add to it. So her question is, if transparency and increasing communication is something that all staff are expected to engage more on, does this mean that some staff who are not resident facing are expected to engage when needed? This includes even if speaking with residents isn't included in job profiles. And so the thing that I should have said and forgot is, as part of our new strategic objective on strengthening trust in us, everybody has had an objective within their performance objectives within their CADs of what they can do to strengthen residents' trust in us. And we're interested in doing some drop-in sessions that Crystal, Maria and the team doing in January, talking to people about how those objectives have gone and what else we might want to put in place coming into the next year, because we're not all that far away from setting performance objectives again for next year. But Helen might want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I said when we opened that the reason I wanted the whole organisation to hear this briefing is that it is aimed at the whole organisation. You know, we are all in customer service, and if role profiles are getting in the way of that, then role profiles might have to be amended. Obviously, some people's jobs are much more frontline than others, but I don't think there's anybody who works for Network who ought ever to be saying, I'm just not speaking to a resident if it's appropriate that they do so. And I speak to residents and was doing so on Tuesday evening this week.
And that was coming up on that Tuesday session, partly through Matt Bird's contribution, but me reflecting on that was put in place something where all senior managers across Network do spend some time talking to residents who aren't very happy, just to show that they are listened to and to get greater insight in terms of what our residents think and what key issues are. And that's certainly something I'm keen to have some further discussions on. We've had a question from Elizabeth on saying, I think one of the key areas to focus on is to ensure that, one, residents do get a response when they contact us and that this response is visible to everybody on the customer hub, and two, when residents are engaging with us as a group, that they receive feedback from us. We need to show them we value their feedback and act on it.
I mean, I agree with both of those points, Elizabeth, but one of the things that we are also debating is, in this age of electronic communication, whether our response times are actually fast enough. Now, I realise that that's potentially a controversial subject for discussion in the organisation, but quite honestly, people don't expect to wait 5 days for an acknowledgement anymore, and quite often we're generating failure demand because we're taking longer to do things than we necessarily have to, and one email turns into 4 emails, or one phone call turns into several phone calls. So I think there is a debate to be had within Network about more immediacy of response to inquiries.
And I put a plug out for a Network Think session we've got at 2 p.m. on the 17th of December, where we're proposing that we move to immediate, or at least next day, response to everything coming into us from residents, and what we'd need to put in place in order to make that happen. So please do come along to that, anyone who's interested in it, and everyone should be. We've had another question come in, which says the white paper comes across as quite one-sided and all responsibility falls onto housing providers. I agree, we must ensure the best possible service to our residents to ensure a safe and happy standard of living. However, is there anything in the paper which sets out expectations from residents, e.g. what responsibilities do our residents have, for example, repair recharges for damages of misuse, being rude to members of staff, not working with landlords to resolve issues?
I mean, I don't think the intention of the white paper was to talk to residents about behaviour. It's something that we need to do. But I think that whenever we have this discussion, this sort of response that it's not all us and it isn't all us, is often the first response. But I think we need to look beyond that at the moment, because there clearly is a problem. If you look at the sort of reputational issues that the sector has, it's not coming from nowhere. There are lots of happy people, and I, as much as anybody, would like to get those voices more heard, particularly in government. But at the moment, the voices that have been heard are generally the unhappy ones, and they are out there, and we've got to try and find a way of addressing the causes of those problems. And we referred earlier to the resident meeting earlier this week. We took up 2 or 3 of the issues that were raised by residents at that meeting, and at least in one case, and probably in more than one case, it was absolutely justified complaints. We had done the absolute bare minimum to try and address somebody's issues. Well, in this circumstances, the bare minimum wasn't enough. So, obviously residents have responsibilities, and I do think one of the things that I think we're quite bad at doing is, when people move into new property, is laying down, this is what the requirements are. If you live in this home, you may not smoke on the balcony. You must not. If you do, we will take action against you. And then we have to follow through on that kind of thing. But that's not what the white paper was trying to do. The white paper was trying to give teeth to people who feel that their concerns and complaints have not been listened to. And you have to remind ourselves that came on the back of the Grenfell disaster, where people were able to show that they had been complaining about safety concerns in that building for a long time.
And I think I would strongly say that if there are things that we can do to address problems, then that absolutely has to be our first responsibility, and we should be getting on and doing those. I think there's a broader point also that we're pretty fortunate in terms of there are a large number of residents who do want to do work with us, who do want to help us improve our services. And on Tuesday, there were a number of people who were pretty unhappy, but also were expressing kind of their commitment and desire to actually work with us to resolve those things. And so if we can do the things within our power, I think there's a whole load of other things that residents can help us with. And like fire safety is one of my examples of, we simply won't have the resources to have somebody going around all the time telling people what they can and can't do. Whereas if residents understand that as a collective responsibility, and that it's about how they can all make each other safe, and we're doing what we are supposed to be doing as well, then I think residents will be willing to do that and willing to work with us to make things better. So I think it comes from both places, but absolutely we should do what we can as our priority.
I think on a slightly more positive response to that, remark, one of the things that the white paper does do and is give us an opportunity to explore who is responsible for what in some of these really contentious areas. So it does talk about antisocial behaviour and it talks about the community trigger, but it clearly signals that there are some circumstances which are really a role for the police and not the landlord, or maybe a role for the mental health services and not the landlord, and tries to triangulate how those relationships should work, because at the moment we tend to be the kind of call of last resort. If somebody's tried the mental health services or the council or the police and they say no, then they come to the landlord. Unfortunately, that doesn't give us any additional powers. The fact that people see us as responsible doesn't give us the powers to take action, and the white paper does acknowledge that that needs to be better explored.
We don't seem to have any other questions. The other thing that might be worth just reflecting on is those performance measures that we ran through and that we've just had quite a lengthy discussion with the G15 chief executives on some of those, and a clear view that some of them are pretty clear about what they're measuring and based on fact, and some of them are strongly based on perception. Is anything you'd add to that, Helen?
Yeah, I mean, the position from the G15 is that we will be campaigning to have as many of these indicators being matters of fact as we possibly can. So how many of these are being done, how many of those kind of complaints are received, how quickly are things being done, rather than, well, one of the more contentious questions in the suggested list is what contribution is your landlord making to your neighbourhood, which is simply not a relevant question to 90% of our residents, and even if it is a relevant question, is an entirely subjective thing based on their understanding of who's responsible for what. So we will try and argue against highly perceptual questions and in favour of factual and evidential questions. The other thing that I think we will do is reflect on regional differences, because this is intended to produce sort of comparative positions. How good is your landlord next to the one operating next door? Well, that might be a reasonable comparison, but if we're being compared to something in the Lake District, then it's not a reasonable comparison. So we will argue for some regional nuances to the regime as well. Yeah, but I mean, I think it is worth bearing in mind that once those indicators are in place, they are pretty much what will be used by the regulator to triangulate with ombudsman complaints and complaints to the building safety regulator to take a view on how well we are meeting consumer standards. So whatever they are, we have to pay close attention to them.
And the way that people perceive things is pretty malleable and changes, and that I've heard a possibly apocryphal story of one housing association that was using the STAR, the Survey of Tenants and Residents methodology, where the first question you have to ask is how satisfied are you with your landlord overall, and you're then able to ask 5 other questions. And I've heard a story that one landlord asked a range of other questions underneath that of like all the individual services that they offer, and then the last question asked again, how satisfied are you with your landlord overall, and the same people answered 12% more positive than they did at the beginning, because they'd had some time to reflect on the different services that had happened. The government have said they don't want measures to be gamed, but clearly where things aren't based in fact, they are very open to that.
Yeah. Okay, if there are no more questions, I think we'll close the session, but I would just plant a reminder about the Network Thinks on the 17th of December. We are talking about very, sharply reducing the response times for inquiries. So if you have a strong view on that, you better come along and share it. And it is based on this principle that everybody has become accustomed to immediacy in the services that they receive. And maybe it's time that we start to adapt to that expectation. And on that note, unless there's any last minute reflections, I think we'll close. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Okay, bye.